Morris. Power steering gremlins. Morris is really summing up at the moment that sort of final stage of the build part where, you know, a lot of people would think, yeah, the car's finished, but the last few bits can throw sort of curveballs at you, which can be surprisingly difficult to resolve, and it's got a perfect example now. So we've been chasing this power steering issue where the pressure relief valve kept sticking. Essentially, you'd drive the car, you'd start the car, it'd be fine, you'd drive the car, and the power steering, you'd lose power steering, and then it would stay lost, and every time we take the pressure relief valve out, it was slightly stuck. And it seemed like there was some kind of debris getting in there, only very fine, but something. It's a sliding shuttle in a bore, a tight-fitting bore, so any amount of sort of metal grit will stop it moving. So we concluded that those metal particles must perhaps have come in the reconditioned pump that we used. Seems like the only source, because the pipe work that we've all made is not metal pipe work. The reservoir, it's mild steel particles that we've found, and the reservoir's aluminium, so it can't really be anything other than something that was already in there. So we decided to put a filter in it, and this is actually perhaps a little learning one for us. We put the filter in what we thought to be a logical point, which was the last point before the entrance to the pump. We've got the best chance of catching everything before it goes in the pump. But actually what we then created was an issue where although it's a 30 micron filter, which I felt to be the biggest we could go and actually meaningfully catch any particles, it was restrictive enough that it was causing the pump to cavitate, because it's only gravity fed from the reservoir. So we then had to backtrack on that, put a new feed pipe back in without the filter, and change the filter to being on the return to the reservoir, so it's being forced through it by the high pressure side of the pump. And we took the power steering pump off, washed all that out to be 100% sure there was no particles in that, washed the reservoir out, washed the remaining pipes out, and rebuilt it all with the filter on the return to the tank, and fingers crossed, so far, it's now working fine. However, we are also battling a small secondary issue. I don't know if you noticed in the previous episode, I might have had a cloth over the cap on the reservoir, and we've been having a little bit of a problem with fluid being pushed out of the vent in the cap. Having looked at that, it's actually a slight oversight in the design of the reservoir, in that we did a drilling up through the whole body of the reservoir so that the oil's returning to the top of the tank in a bid to give it a good chance of de-aerating as it kind of swirls down the walls of the tank back into the fluid. Problem we've got is it's actually forming a solid sheet of oil over the bottom of the neck that the cap sits into, which means any venting out actually draws that oil out with it. So we're going to have to just introduce some kind of little shield in there that just ducts the return oil back down, rather than it being able to sheet across the top of the tank and over the inside of the cap. But hopefully with that done, that will be all the power steering gremlins sorted, and we can get back onto the road and seeing how we get on from there. So we're sort of slowly getting through, but it's nice that we're making positive progress on it. You're also doing the centre caps for the Morris Minor. Yes, nicely modelled right here. We've had to do a revision on you got the original seatbelt guide for the Morris. Now actually this was entirely my fault, because I described these from a purely visual point of view of saying, yes, it should look like this, and then actually we realised when it's in the car, the seatbelt kind of goes into this V and goes quite tight when you try and pull it on. So we're doing a revised version of that at the moment. Right, have a wander over here. You have to excuse me if I'm getting a bit vague and off-piste in some places, because it's always difficult doing the entire tour by yourself because there's so much to remember. So Morris, good news and bad. The good news is the power steering fault is definitely gone now. So I've been out testing this the last couple of days, never had any return of that sticking pressure relief valve. Also, we've resolved the fact there was some fluid coming out of the vent on the cap. We've made a little fabricated shield that sits on the bottom of the cap. The caps are our own design, and they had a little female thread in them, and they have a little filter that threads in the inside, a little sintered filter. So we've actually used the same thread to make a little machined shield that guides where the oil was sheeting across the bottom of the cap and being thrown out through the breather. It kind of just sheets around the sides of this little shield now, and that works really well. Didn't get any fluid out of that on test. The downside is I still do have the clutch slip problem, and I'm starting to think it is actually the clutch slipping. It doesn't seem to be hydraulic actuation. Well, I took it out again, same symptoms, wasn't there when it was cold, did start to slip after I'd driven it for a few miles. But we brought it in here and put it straight over the pit immediately when it had been slipping. And I figure if it was a hydraulic actuation issue, there would still be pressure. The clutch would be being held on by a body of fluid in the slave cylinder, and therefore if you crack the bleed nipple loose, there should be a load of pressure in there as the clutch is released. And we tried that and there wasn't, and immediately after cracking the bleed nipple, not finding that there was loads of pressure in the slave and doing it back up, we took it straight back out and it was immediately slipping, which I think is fairly conclusive on it not being hydraulically held, partially disengaged. So we're getting to the point where I can't think of anything else other than it's just that when it gets hot after a few uses, it starts to slip because maybe the clamping force isn't enough. So we're just gonna, I think we're at the point now, we're gonna have to drop the gearbox out of it and investigate that. And I've kind of got this sort of feeling of dread that I don't want to do all of that work and then just go, yes, everything looks absolutely fine. But I've kind of got to the point, I don't think that it can be anything else now. So that's the next step. James is working through a few other jobs on this. We've still got to do a micro switch on the handbrake for the warning light, a bezel for the handbrake gaiter, and a few other small jobs inside. So he's kind of working through those at the minute. I can also see, conveniently looking through there, that George's 3D print prototype of the revised seatbelt guide is in as well. So that's looking good. Morris. So well, I will say it's a positive. Obviously, we have the gearbox out, which is never a great thing after you've built a car. But I was kind of dreading, I had this sinking feeling of, you know, we've been chasing this clutch slip issue. Are we going to pull the gearbox out, look at it, go, yes, everything looks fine, and then still be scratching our heads over what it was? But that hasn't been the case. We've taken it all apart, and the clutch kit, which was supplied as a kit, does not appear to have enough clamping force. So we've only got I mean, just laying it here on the bench, the friction plates, I think it was about 0.5 or 0.6 of a mil proud of the actual mounting face of the pressure plate, which is well under what it needs to be. My suspicion is that this pressure plate actually needs an 8 mil thick friction disc, and this is more like 7 or just over 7. So we're going to sort out a replacement friction plate for this, which will have the appropriate amount of clamping force. So slightly irritated. If the long-term followers will remember, we had a very similar problem with Gordon's car, where we were chasing a problem which turned out to be a faulty clutch kit. Anyway, I'm kind of just glad that we have found something positive on that. And then James, in the meantime, has been working on the handbrake lever. So he's machined up a nice grip for the handbrake lever. He's made a mounting for a micro switch for the warning light on the handbrake, and he's just making a little sort of bezel plate, or retainer plate, shall we say, that bolts down under the handbrake and will in turn mount a bezel which finishes off the gaiter on the handbrake. I think he's also done the gear gaiter, attached that to the bezel, which we already had. So last details really on that, which we're just ticking through whilst we kind of get through this mechanical job. Hopefully we'll resolve this, get the gearbox in, and then I'll be back out on the road for the next series of tests on this. Yeah, so all looking reasonably positive. You know, annoying that there's a problem, frustrating, as you know, it's not really our doing, but glad that we've got a positive result on what's causing it. Another one that's basically in the latter stages, Morris. So you'll know we've been battling the clutch, which actually, I think I'd shown it out of the car last week, and we determined that it seemed that the clutch we'd been supplied just had 2 thinner friction plates in it. Now I suspected it was a standard MX5 friction plate, which I believe should be thicker than the one. I think when we pulled out, we measured it, it was something like 7.2 or 7.3 millimeters, 7.2 I think it was. And I was fairly sure a standard one should be close to 8. So I've just bought a standard MX5 clutch friction plate, and sure enough, yes, it was close to it. I think it was about 7.9 mil, which looked much more how the friction plate should be to match the pressure plate we've got. So I suspect the company that put together the clutch kit was putting standard MX5 friction plates in there on the basis that they would all be 7.9, close to 8 millimeters thick. And it just happens that a particular manufacturer's friction plate has been undersized, perhaps because the matching pressure plate was to suit an undersized friction disc. I mean, who knows? But anyway, the standard one looked a lot better. We've got that in, everything back in, and I've just driven this today, and it's absolutely spot on. So very glad to have that resolved. So that's the power steering issues resolved, the clutch issues resolved. We're getting pretty close to just getting some more miles on this now. I'm going to do a quick check there's a little bit of an odd feeling on the brake. It's got a remote servo, and it sort of feels as if you've got some servo assistance and then it drops off and then takes a sec to catch up again. And I think it might be the one-way valve we've got in the vacuum pipe to the servo, possibly restricting the flow. So you're getting a bit of sort of servo assistance and then it drops off a bit and then it kind of catches up. So hopefully that's what that is. James has been on also with the housing for the handbrake. So he's just been making a fabricated housing that will mount the gaiter for the handbrake lever. So we're kind of into details like that really. Hopefully next week I'll be out in this looking like good weather. We'll tie up a few of these loose ends in terms of interior. I've received the centre caps for the wheels back from machining now. They're just away being anodised, and when they're back we can do the lasering of the logos into them. So yeah, we're getting extremely close, and I'm just happy to have the clutch slip issue resolved. And it's almost daft that it was something it was just a slipping clutch, but obviously I went through all those motions of trying to diagnose the hydraulic side of things just because I really didn't want to have to pull everything apart gearbox wise. Right, moving on from that, Morris, a few things on this. We had a load of anodising back last week. One of those things was the centre caps for these, so they are now going to Bruce Holder, who is going to do my laser engraving, and we're going to do the M logo that we did on the bulkhead pressed into it, lasered into the centre caps for that. And then James has been working on the handbrake gaiter surround and warning light switch arrangement, which is about done now. He's then handed over to Luke, who's just been designing a little billet bezel to finish that off, but we're at the point now where it's machine the bezel, do the gaiter, and that lock can go in. And then he's actually just moved on to a job which, it was, by my own admission, a bit of an afterthought job. We've got the battery nestled away under some panelling in the back there, and it's got a charge point there so you can trickle charge it and see the status of the battery. But it did dawn on us, after having put it all together, that we've got no way of isolating that battery in a hurry, or disconnecting it at all if you want to work on the car without taking a load of the interior out. So as an afterthought, we've decided actually to put an isolator in there, so it's just modifying that cover panel over the battery to put a little isolator in. So if you wanted to disconnect the battery in a hurry for either maintenance or if there was some sort of emergency electrical situation going on, you can just kill the battery really quickly. So get that in and that'll button that up, and I think actually we're really going down the last little bits and bobs of road testing and ready for handover on this now. So very exciting point to be at. And Morris, the wheel centre caps we just recently had machined and black anodised. They're having the Morris M logo etched into those. What else? The key fob pouches, something we've done on a couple of cars now. we're kind of using generic central locking, aftermarket central locking kits because there isn't a lot available other than that if you want to do an aftermarket central locking setup. And the fobs don't look amazing, so we've started making these little stitched leather pouches that the fobs are really tight fit into, and then lasering into it what the buttons do, and you basically press the buttons through the leather. So we're just having those lasered for the Morris as well, and I think we were just re-lasering the fluid caps on the Morris. You might have noticed in the videos previously, there's 3 caps for screen wash, brake fluid, and God, what's the other one? Power steering. And the first time round, we wanted them all orientated, the logos orientated the right way when the lids were done up. And the first time round, when it was lasered, the cap must have moved in the jig and it was slightly out of line. So I sent that to be redone, and then the lasering depth wasn't quite the same, so it was slightly paler lasering than the others. So I've just decided to do another set of 3 just so they all match perfectly and line up. The Morris, I was out in again today. So I think last week we mentioned decided we'd put an isolator in it. So James did a really nice job of machining up a sort of recessed bezel that put a traditional key type isolator in the interior trim panel that covers the battery behind the passenger seat, but sinking it in really flush so it doesn't sort of stick out massively proud of the panel. So that's all back together now. And then while we had the passenger seat out, actually, that we tackled a job we'd been meaning to do for ages. You might have noticed previously the wipers were sort of up at the side of the screen. Now on these, they're a clap hands wiper as they call it, so they go from the side to the centre, rather than kind of being offset and both sweeping the same way. But when we fitted the wiper motor, we didn't set the park cam position right. So in these Lucas wiper motors, there's a gear that just spins, and that effectively is attached to a crank which just pushes and pulls a flexible rack, which then engages with little gears in the wiper spindles that operate the wipers. So it's just a pushing and pulling movement. Now what sets where that parks is a little cam on the back of the gear itself, which closes and opens a contact, and that sets basically whether the mechanism parks in its pushed or pulled position. And we had it set the wrong side, so we've just, while we had the seat out, Gibbo did the unenviable task of grovelling around in the footwell, getting that motor pulled down, changing that cam around and putting it all back together. So that's now the correct way. And then yeah, I've been out in this again today, feeling really good. Still, you know, the overriding feeling of driving the car is it feels incredibly composed, incredibly precise, steering spot on, suspension spot on. Really can't fault any of that. The engine feels strong, sounds good, gear shift's good, clutch is now faultless. Only thing I've still got to tackle is we got this slight sensation in the brake pedal, should we say, where it feels like immediately when you press it, it's not got much servo assistance, and then the servo assistance kind of ramps up and you get a lot more brake pressure with no more increase in pedal pressure. And we thought it might be the one-way valve in the vacuum line restricting it, so we changed that from like a sprung ball valve to a diaphragm valve for this drive, and that didn't really make any difference. So what we're going to look at next is actually just putting a little vacuum reservoir in the line, which is going to be fairly easy. There's a good bit of space underneath the car. So after the one-way valve before the servo, we're going to put a reservoir in there and see if that solves the problem, having an actual permanent reservoir of vacuum in there, and see how it goes after that. But yeah, all going well on that. So Morris, Gibbo's been on with the vacuum tank. We talked about the fact that we're tackling this slight oddity in the way the brake pedal feels. It feels like the vacuum assistance has a slight delay on it. It's got a remote servo which is at the back, and we were wondering whether having a vacuum reservoir near the servo might improve that. So at the moment Gibbo's just made up a stainless steel vacuum reservoir, tucks up in front of the subframe here. Just buttoning up the last details on that, and I'll be able to test that next week. So fingers crossed that is that sorted. Dean dropped off the visors for this, so I've just got to fit those. And I'm waiting on the laser engraved bits from Bruce again for the little caps in the engine bay, which I think I talked about last week. The Morris, we were tackling a slight oddity with the brake pedal feel on it. It just sort of pulses slightly, or resists slightly and then goes again. And I thought it was a delay in the vacuum assistance. It's running a dual circuit remote servo. So we put a vacuum reservoir on it, which seemed to improve it slightly, but not vastly. So we've just been going through a few other things, and we've actually replaced the entire remote servo unit. And it's exactly the same. We've chopped and changed a couple of one-way valves in the vacuum system, and it's exactly the same. So I'm pretty much coming to the conclusion that that's just how those remote servos feel. It's not really detrimental. The brakes are absolutely fine, and you completely get used to the feel of it. It's just for the first time you drive it, you think, oh, it's a bit strange, because it's sort of, your pedal seems to go, resist slightly, and then go again, if you're sort of really analysing the feel of the pedal. But yeah, I think we're just going to be on with test driving it. Now I'm happy that there is no fault with that system. I think we're good to go on that. Morris, happy to report that the brakes, although I think last week I said sort of we'd changed the whole remote servo assembly, but the problem of the pedal feel being slightly odd remained. Now Adam was only kind of assessing that while using his hand on the pedal and thought it still felt the same. However, I went out for a test drive in it and it's absolutely fine now. So very happy to report that brake pedal feel fine now. The only remaining mechanical niggle I was reporting on test drives was there was a slight vibration from somewhere on the body when you were on the overrun, which we thought maybe the exhaust contacting something, because we've left the engine on fairly soft mounts on this to try and give it a good level of refinement. And yeah, we had a bit of an inspection that the exhaust was just vibrating on actually one of the bell housing bolts. So it wasn't even the relative movement of the engine. It was just that because there's a bit of movement in the exhaust in certain positions, it was just vibrating on the head of a bolt on a bell housing. So we've literally just swapped that from a cap head to a dome head, and that's given us sort of 4 or 5 mil clearance. Test drive it again. Really happy with it now. Like, no mechanical faults. So good to drive. I've thought that every time I've driven it. You know, the controls feel fantastic. Everything about it, gearbox, clutch, steering, suspension, it just feels a very composed package. So we're just now buttoning up a few last little things. I've got to get the revised, waiting for the revised seatbelt guides to be machined, because I think I mentioned before they kind of snag slightly. James is just doing a revision on the centre console, that's why that's out. We realised that the electric window buttons, the terminals on one side, were very close to the sort of raised section of the gearbox shifter area, and we were worried that in certain movements it could actually contact and short the terminals. So we've just, those switches that we've used could be fitted in 2 ways. They can be fitted with a slight spacer ring behind, or you put the spacer ring on the back and have them flush. So we're just swapping them to having the spacers on the front, so there'll be slightly raised buttons, but it'll give us 10 mil of clearance on there, or 10 mil more than there was. So yeah, tickling through those things, and I think pending getting that lot back together and getting a good chunk of miles on it, now I'm happy with everything mechanically, I think we're going to be pretty much at handover point on that, so that is good. So that's where we're at with that. Morris, I've obviously just received that part back, which kind of is the remaining part on the interior. Now I've just got to get out and get some more miles on this now. I think I said last week I'm happy with how it all drives now. I was just waiting for that bit. I kind of wanted to have the handbrake in and assembled, because you need that leather surround to actually get the handbrake lever bolted in. It goes in at the same time. And although I've done some test driving in it, before I get too spirited in my driving, I kind of fancied having an emergency brake there. So I'm going to get that in and get the handbrake done, and then I'll go out and get some more miles on that, which I'm really looking forward to. I enjoy driving that thing, so getting some miles on and yeah, working towards handing it over. And actually, that's just reminded me of one last thing. The little guides, we revised the guides that the seat belt comes through on the sides of the seat. The original design actually meant that seat belts went a bit tight as you pulled them. So we've tweaked that design. Those have been machined by, and I'm going to have to put a little subtitle in here because I can't remember his name. I think the guy's name is Jonathan Plumridge. He can't remember the company name, but he introduced himself a little while back to me. He said maybe I could take on some of your machining work, and we've got an ever-growing stack of machining. And while Andy Concept 303 is extremally good and continues to be, you know, top-notch to deal with, he's only got a 3-axis, and some of the parts are quite complicated and demand a 5-axis machine. And so perhaps if we're happy with the results, Jonathan may well become one of our go-to machinists. So watch this space on that.